Oh, every honeybee fills with jealousy when they see you out with me. I don't blame them, goodness knows. Honeysuckle rose.
Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself. Big Ben was striking as she stepped out into the street. It was 11 o'clock, and the unused hour was fresh, as if issued to children on a beach. But there was something solemn in the deliberate swing of the repeated strokes, something stirring in the murmur of wheels and the shuffle of footsteps. No doubt they were not all bound on errands of happiness. There is much more to be said about us than that we walk the streets of Westminster. Big Ben, too, is nothing but steel rods consumed by rust, written up for the care of H.M.'s Office of Works. Only for Mrs. Dalloway, the moment was complete. For Mrs. Dalloway, June was fresh. A happy childhood. And it was not to his daughters alone that Justin Parry had seemed a fine fellow, weak, of course, on the bench, flowers at evening, smoke rising, the caw of rooks falling from ever so high, down, down through the October air. There's nothing to take the place of childhood. A leaf of mint brings it back, or a cup with a blue ring. Poor little wretches, she sighed, and pressed forward. Oh, right under the horses' noses, you little demon! And there she was, left on the curb, stretching her hand out, while Jimmy Dawes grinned on the further side. A charming woman, poised, eager, strangely white-haired for her pink cheeks, so Scope Purvis C.B. saw her as he hurried to his office. She stiffened a little, waiting for Dirtnell's van to pass. Big Ben struck the 10th, struck the 11th stroke. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Pride held her erect, inheriting, handing on, acquainted with discipline and with suffering. How people suffered, how they suffered, she thought, thinking of Mrs. Foxcroft at the embassy last night, decked with jewels, eating her heart out because that nice boy was dead. And now the old manor house. Dirtnell's van passed. Must go to a cousin. Good morning to you, said Hugh Whitbread, raising his hat rather extravagantly by the china shop, for they'd known each other as children. Where are you off to? I love walking in London, said Mrs. Dalloway. Really, it's better than walking in the country. Oh, we've just come up, said Hugh Whitbread, unfortunately to see doctors. Milly, said Mrs. Dalloway, instantly compassionate. Out of sorts, said Hugh Whitbread, that sort of thing. Dick all right? First rate, said Clarissa. Of course, she thought, walking on. Milly's about my age, 50, 52. So it's probably that. Hugh's manner had said so, said it perfectly. Dear old Hugh, thought Mrs. Dalloway, remembering with amusement, with gratitude, with emotion, how shy, like a brother, or one would rather die than speak to one's brother, Hugh had always been, when he was at Oxford and came over, and perhaps one of them, drat the thing, couldn't ride. How then could women sit in Parliament? How could they do things with men? But there's this extraordinarily deep instinct, something inside one, you can't get over it, there's no use trying, and men like Hugh respect it without our saying, which is what one loves, thought Clarissa, in dear old Hugh. She'd passed through the Admiralty Arch and saw at the end of the empty road, with its thin trees, Victoria's white mound, Victoria's billowing motherliness, amplitude and homeliness. All was ridiculous, yet how sublime, thought Mrs. Dalloway, remembering Kensington Gardens and the old lady in horn spectacles, and being told by Nanny to stop dead still and bow to the Queen. The flag flew above the palace. Oh, the King and Queen were back then. Dick had met her at lunch the other day, a thoroughly nice woman. It matters so much to the poor, thought Clarissa, and to the soldiers. A man in bronze stood heroically on a pedestal with a gun on her left-hand side. The South African War. It matters, thought Mrs. Dalloway, walking towards Buckingham Palace. There it stood, foursquare, in the broad sunshine, uncompromising, plain. But it was character, she thought, something inborn in the race. The Queen went to hospitals, opened bazaars. Queen of England, thought Clarissa, looking at the palace. Already at this hour a motor car passed out of the gates. Soldiers saluted and the gates were shut. And Clarissa, crossing the road, entered the park, holding herself upright. June had drawn out every leaf on the trees. The mothers of Westminster, with mottled breasts, gave suck to their young. Quite respectable girls lay stretched on the grass. An elderly man, stooping very stiffly, picked up a crumpled paper, spread it out flat and flung it away. How horrible! Last night at the embassy, Sir Dighton had said, "If I want a fellow to hold my horse, I only have to put up my hand." But the religious question is far more serious than the economic, Sir Dighton had said, which she thought extraordinarily interesting from a man like Sir Dighton. "Oh, the country will never know what it's lost," he had said, talking of his own accord about dear Jack Stewart. She mounted the little hill lightly. The air stirred with energy. Messages were passing from the Fleet to the Admiralty. Piccadilly and Arlington Street and the Mall seemed to chafe the very air in the park and lift its leaves hotly, brilliantly, upon waves of that divine vitality that Clarissa loved. To ride, to dance, she'd adored all that. Or going for long walks in the country, talking about books, what to do with one's life. For young people were amazingly priggish. Oh, the things one had said, but one had conviction. Middle age is the devil. People like Jack will never know that, she thought, for he never once thought of death. Never, they said, knew he was dying. And now can never mourn. How did it go? A head grown grey from the contagion of the world's slow stain. I've drunk their cup a round or two before. From the contagion of the world's slow stain. She held herself upright. But how Jack would have shouted, quoting Shelley in Piccadilly. "You want a pin," he would have said. He hated frumps. My God, Clarissa, my God, Clarissa. She could hear him now at the Devonshire House party, about poor Sylvia Hunt in her amber necklace and that dowdy old silk. Clarissa held herself upright, for she had spoken aloud, and now she was in Piccadilly, passing the house with the slender green columns and the balconies, passing club windows full of newspapers, passing old Lady Burdett Coutts' house, where the glazed white parrot used to hang, and Devonshire House without its gilt leopards, and Claridge's, where she must remember Dick wanted her to leave a card on Mrs. Jetson or she would be gone. Rich Americans can be very charming. There was St. James's Palace, like a child's game with bricks, and now she'd passed Bond Street. She was by Hatchard's bookshop. The stream was endless, endless, endless. Lords, Ascot, Hurlingham. What was it? What a duck, she thought, looking at the frontispiece of some book of memoirs spread wide in the bow window. Sir Joshua, perhaps, or Romney. Arch, bright, demure, the sort of girl, like her own Elizabeth, the only real sort of girl. And there was that absurd book, Soapy Sponge, which Jim used to quote by the yard, and Shakespeare's sonnets. She knew them by heart. Phil and she had argued all day about the Dark Lady, and Dick had said straight out at dinner that night that he'd never heard of her. Really, she'd married him for that. He'd never read Shakespeare. There must be some little cheap book she could buy for Milly. Cranford, of course. Was there anything so enchanting as the cow in petticoats? If only people had that sort of humour, that sort of self-respect now, thought Clarissa, for she remembered the broad pages, the sentences ending, the characters, how one talked about them as if they were real. For all the great things, one must go to the past, she thought. From the contagion of the world's slow stain, fear no more the heat of the sun, and now can never mourn, she repeated, her eyes straying over the window, for it ran in her head. The test of great poetry. The moderns had never written anything one wanted to read about death, she thought, and turned. Omnibuses joined motor cars, vans, taxicabs, motor cars. Oh, he was an open motor car with a girl alone. Up till 4, her feet tingling. I know, thought Clarissa. The girl looked washed out, half asleep in the corner of the car after the dance. And another car came, and another. No, 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 Clarissa smiled good-naturedly. The fat lady had taken every sort of trouble, but diamonds, orchids at this hour of the morning. No, no, no. The excellent policeman would, when the time came, hold up his hand. Another motor car passed. Oh, how utterly unattractive. Why should a girl of that age paint black round her eyes? And a young man with a girl at this hour when the country... The admiral policeman raised his hand, and Clarissa, acknowledging his sway, taking her time, crossed, walked towards Bond Street, saw the narrow, crooked street, the yellow banners, the thick-notched telegraph wire stretched across the sky. 100 years ago, her great-great-grandfather, Seymour Parry, who ran away with Conway's daughter, had walked down Bond Street. Down Bond Street the Parrys had walked for 100 years, and might have met the Dalloways, or Lees on the mother's side, going up. Her father got his clothes from Hill's. There was a roll of cloth in the window, and here just one jar on a black table, incredibly expensive, like the thick pink salmon on the ice block at the fishmonger's. The jewels were exquisite. Pink and orange stars, paste, Spanish, she thought, and chains of old gold, starry buckles, little brooches which had been worn on sea-green satin by ladies with high headdresses, but no good looking. She must economise. She must go on past the picture dealers, where one of the odd French pictures hung, as if people had thrown confetti, pink and blue, for a joke. If you'd live with pictures, and it's the same with books and music, thought Clarissa, passing the Aeolian Hall, you can't be taken in by a joke. The river of Bond Street was clogged. There, like a queen at a tournament, raised, regal, was Lady Bexborough. She sat in her carriage, upright, alone, looking through her glasses. The white glove was loose at her wrist. She was in black, quite shabby, yet, thought Clarissa, how extraordinarily it tells. Breeding, self-respect, never saying a word too much or letting people gossip. An astonishing friend. No one can pick a hole in her after all these years. And now there she is, thought Clarissa, passing the Countess, who waited, powdered, perfectly still. And Clarissa would have given anything to be like that, the mistress of Clarefield, talking politics like a man. She never goes anywhere, thought Clarissa, and it's quite useless to ask her. And the carriage went on, and Lady Bexborough was borne past like a queen at a tournament, though she had nothing to live for. And the old man is failing, and they say she's sick of it all, thought Clarissa, and the tears actually rose to her eyes as she entered the shop. Good morning, said Clarissa in her charming voice. Gloves, she said in her exquisite friendliness, and putting her bag on the counter, began very slowly to undo the buttons. White gloves, she said, above the elbow, and she looked straight into the shopwoman's face. But this was not the girl she remembered. She looked quite old. These really don't fit, said Clarissa. The shop girl looked at them. Madam's wears bracelets. Clarissa spread out her fingers. Oh, perhaps it's my rings. And the girl took the grey gloves with her to the end of the counter. Yes, thought Clarissa, but it's the girl I remember. She's 20 years older. There was only one other customer, sitting sideways at the counter, her elbow poised, her hand drooping, vacant, like a figure on a Japanese fan, thought Clarissa. Too vacant, perhaps. Yet some men would adore her. The lady shook her head sadly. Again the gloves were too large. She turned round the glass. About the wrist, she reproached the grey-headed woman, who looked and agreed. They waited. A clock ticked. Bond Street hummed, dulled, distant. The woman went away holding gloves. Above the wrist, said the lady mournfully, raising her voice. And she'd have to order chairs, ices, flowers, and cloakroom tickets, thought Clarissa. The people she didn't want would come, the others wouldn't. She would stand by the door. They sold stockings, silk stockings. A lady is known by her gloves and her shoes, old Uncle William used to say. And through the hanging silk stockings, quivering silver, she looked at the lady, sloping shoulders, her hand drooping, her bag slipping, her eyes vacantly on the floor. It would be intolerable if dowdy women came to her party. Who would have liked Keats if he'd worn red socks? Oh, at last she drew into the counter, and it flashed into her mind. Do you remember, before the war, you had gloves with pearl buttons? French gloves, madam. Yes, they were French, said Clarissa. The other lady rose very sadly and took her bag and looked at the gloves on the counter. But they were all too large, always too large at the wrist. With pearl buttons, said the shop girl, who looked ever so much older. She split the length of tissue paper apart on the counter. With pearl buttons, thought Clarissa. Perfectly simple. How French. Madam's hands are so slender, said the shop girl, drawing the glove firmly, smoothly down over her rings, and Clarissa looked at her arm in the looking-glass. The glove hardly came to the elbow. Were there others half an inch longer? Still, it seemed tiresome to bother her. Perhaps the one day in the month, thought Clarissa, when it's an agony to stand. Oh, don't bother, she said, but the gloves were brought. Don't you get fearfully tired, she said in her charming voice, standing? When do you get your holiday? Oh, in September, madam, when we're not so busy. When we're in the country, thought Clarissa, or shooting. She has a fortnight at Brighton, some stuffy lodging. The landlady takes the sugar. Nothing would be easier than to send her to Mrs. Lumley's right in the country, and it was on the tip of her tongue. But then she remembered how on their honeymoon Dick had shown her the folly of giving impulsively. And it was more important, he said, to get trade with China. Of course he was right. And she could feel the girl wouldn't like to be given things. There she was in her place. So was Dick. Selling gloves was her job. She had her own sorrows, quite separate. And now can never mourn, the words ran in her head. From the contagion of the world's slow stain, thought Clarissa, holding her arms stiff. For there are moments when it seems utterly futile. The glove was drawn off, leaving her arm flecked with powder. Simply one doesn't believe, thought Clarissa, any more in God. The traffic suddenly roared. The silk stockings brightened. A customer came in. White gloves, she said, with some ring in her voice that Clarissa remembered. It used, thought Clarissa, to be so simple. Down, down through the air came the caw of the rooks. When Sylvia died hundreds of years ago, the yew hedges looked so lovely with the diamond webs in the mist before early church. But if Dick were to die tomorrow, as for believing in God, no, she'd let the children choose, but for herself, like Lady Bexborough, who opened the bazaar, they say, with a telegram in her hand, Roden, her favourite, killed. She would go on. But why, if one doesn't believe? For the sake of others, she thought, taking the gloves in her hand. This girl would be much more unhappy if she didn't believe. 30 shillings, said the shopwoman. No, pardon me, madam, 35. The French gloves are more. For one doesn't live for oneself, thought Clarissa. And then the other customer took a glove, tugged it, and it split. There, she exclaimed. Fault of the skin, said the grey-haired woman hurriedly. Oh, sometimes a drop of acid in the tanning. Try this pair, madam. But it's an awful swindle to ask £2.10. Clarissa looked at the lady. The lady looked at Clarissa. Gloves have never been quite so reliable since the war, said the shop girl, apologising to Clarissa. But where had she seen the other lady? Elderly, with a frill under her chin, wearing a black ribbon for gold eyeglasses. Sensual, elderly, clever, like a sergeant drawing. How one could tell from a voice when people are in the habit, thought Clarissa, of making other people. It's a shade too tight, she said. Obey. The shopwoman went off again. Clarissa was left waiting. Fear no more, she repeated, laying her finger on the counter. Fear no more the heat of the sun. Fear no more, she repeated. There were little brown spots on her arm, and the girl crawled like a snail. Thou thy worldly task hast done. Thousands of young men had died that things might go on. At last, half an inch above the elbow, pearl buttons, 5 1/4. My dear slow coach, thought Clarissa, do you think I can sit here the whole morning? Now you'll take 25 minutes to bring me my change. There was a violent explosion in the street outside. The shopwomen cowered behind the counters, but Clarissa, sitting very upright, smiled at the other lady. Miss Anstruther, she exclaimed. James Morrison, Wetherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, Mother, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me. James Morrison's mother put on a golden gown. James Morrison's mother drove to the end of the town. James Morrison's mother said to herself, said she, I can get right down to the end of the town and be back in time for tea. King John put up a notice, lost or stolen or strayed. James Morrison's mother seems to have been mislaid. Last seen wandering vaguely, quite of her own accord. She tried to get down to the end of the town, 40 shillings reward. James Morrison, commonly known as Jim, told his other relations not to go blaming him. James said to his mother, Mother, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town without consulting me. James Morrison's mother hasn't been heard of since. King John said he was sorry, so did the Queen and Prince. King John, somebody told me, said to a man he knew, if people go down to the end of the town, well, what can anyone do? JJMMWGUP took great CO his M, though he was only 3. JJ said to his M, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me. He laughed involuntarily as the Olive rolled towards his chair across the shiny parquet floor of the hotel dining room. His table in the cavernous salle à manger was apart. He sat alone, a solitary guest. The table from which the Olive fell and rolled towards him was some distance away. The angle, however, made him an unlikely objective, yet the lopsided, juicy thing, after hesitating once or twice en route as it plopped along, came to rest finally against his feet. It settled with an inviting, almost an aggressive air. He stooped and picked it up, putting it rather self-consciously, because of the girl from whose table it had come, on the white tablecloth beside his plate. Then looking up, he caught her eye and saw that she too was laughing, though not a bit self-consciously. As she helped herself to the hors d'oeuvre, a false move had sent it flying. She watched him pick the olive up and set it beside his plate. Her eyes then suddenly looked away again at her mother, questioningly. The incident was closed, but the little oblong succulent olive lay beside his plate, so that his fingers played with it. He fingered it automatically from time to time until his lonely meal was finished. When no one was looking, he slipped it into his pocket as though, having taken the trouble to pick it up, this was the very least he could do with it. Heaven alone knows why, but he then took it upstairs with him, setting it on the marble mantelpiece among his field glasses, tobacco tins, ink bottles, pipes, and candlestick. At any rate, he kept it, the moist, shiny, lopsided, juicy little oblong olive. The hotel lounge wearied him. He came to his room after dinner, to smoke at his ease, his coat off and his feet on a chair, to read another chapter of Freud, to write a letter or two he didn't in the least want to write, and then go to bed at 10 o'clock. But this evening the olive kept rolling between him and the thing he read. It rolled beneath the paragraphs, between the lines. The olive was more vital than the interest of these eternal complexes and suppressed desires. The truth was that he kept seeing the eyes of the laughing girl beyond the bouncing olive. She'd smiled at him in such a natural, spontaneous, friendly way before her mother's glance had checked her. A smile, he felt, that might lead to acquaintance on the morrow. He wondered. A thrill of possible adventure ran through him. She was a merry-looking sort of girl with a happy, half-roguish face that seemed on the lookout for someone to play with. Her mother, like most of the people in the big hotel, was an invalid, the girl a dutiful and patient daughter. They had arrived that very day, apparently. A laugh is a revealing thing, he thought, as he fell asleep to dream of a lopsided olive rolling consciously towards him, and of a girl's eyes that watched its awkward movements, then looked up into his own and laughed. In his dream, the olive had been deliberately and cleverly dispatched upon its uncertain journey. It was a message. He did not know, of course, that the mother, chiding her daughter's awkwardness, had muttered, "There you are again, child, true to your name. We never see an olive without doing something queer and odd with it." A youngish man whose knowledge of chemistry, including invisible inks and such-like mysteries, had proved so valuable to the census department that for 5 years he had overworked without a holiday. The Italian Riviera had attracted him, and he'd come out for 2 months' rest. It was his first visit. Sun, mimosa, blue seas and brilliant skies had tempted him. Exchange made a pound worth 40, 50, 60 and 70 shillings. He found the place lovely but somewhat untenanted. Having chosen at random, he'd come to a spot where the companionship he hoped to find did not exist. The place languished after the war, slow to recover. The colony of resident English was scattered still. Travellers preferred the coast of France with Mentone and Monte Carlo to enliven them. The country, moreover, was distracted by strikes. The electric light failed 1 week, letters the next, and as soon as the electricians and postal workers resumed, the railway stopped running. Few visitors came, and the few who came soon left. He stayed on, however, caught by the sunshine and the good exchange, also without the physical energy to discover a better, livelier place. He went for walks among the olive groves. He sat beside the sea and the palms. He visited shops and bought things he didn't want because the exchange made them seem cheap. He paid immense extras in his weekly bill, then chuckled as he reduced them to shillings and found that a few pence covered them. He lay with a book for hours among the olive groves. The olive groves. His daily life could not escape the olive groves. 2 olive groves sooner or later. His walks, his expeditions, his meanderings by the sea, his shopping, all led him to these ubiquitous olive groves. If he bought a picture postcard to send home, there was sure to be an olive grove in one corner of it. The whole place was smothered with olive groves. The people owed their incomes and existence to these irrepressible trees. The villages among the hills swam roof deep in them. They swarmed even in the hotel gardens. The guidebooks praised them as persistently as the residents brought them sooner or later into every conversation. They grew lyrical over them. "And how do you like our olive trees?" "Ah, you think them pretty." "At first most people are disappointed. They grow on one." "They do," he agreed. "I'm glad you appreciate them. I find them the embodiment of grace. And when the wind lifts the under leaves across a whole mountain slope, why, it's wonderful, isn't it? One realizes the meaning of olive green." "One does," he sighed, "but all the same, I should like to get one to eat. An olive, I mean." "Ah, to eat. Yes, that's not so easy. You see, the crop is—" "Exactly," he interrupted impatiently, weary of the habitual and evasive explanations. "But I should like to taste the fruit. I should like to enjoy one." For after a stay of 6 weeks, he had never seen an olive on the table, in the shops, nor even on the street barrows at the marketplace. He'd never tasted one. No one sold olives, though olive trees were a drug in the place. No one bought them, no one asked for them. It seemed that no one wanted them. The trees, when he looked closely, were thick with a dark little berry that seemed more like a sour sloe than the succulent, delicious, spicy fruit associated with its name. Men climbed the trunks, everywhere shaking the laden branches and hitting them with long bamboo poles to knock the fruit off, while women and children, squatting on their haunches, spent laborious hours filling baskets underneath, then loading mules and donkeys with their daily catch. but an olive to eat was unobtainable. He'd never cared for olives, but now he craved with all his soul to feel his teeth in one. "Ah, but it is the Spanish olive that you eat," explained the head waiter, a German from Basel. "These are for oil only." After which he disliked the olive more than ever, until that night when he saw the first eatable specimen rolling across the shiny parquet floor, propelled towards him by the careless hand of a pretty girl, who then looked up into his eyes and smiled. He was convinced that Eve similarly had rolled the apple towards Adam across the emerald sward of the first garden in the world. He slept usually like the dead. It must have been something very real that made him open his eyes and sit up in bed alertly. There was a noise against the door. He listened. The room was still quite dark. It was early morning. The noise was repeated. "Who's there?" he asked in a sleepy whisper. "What is it?" The noise came again. Someone was scratching at the door. No, it was someone tapping. "What do you want?" he demanded in a louder voice. "Come in," he added, wondering sleepily whether he was presentable. Either the hotel was on fire or the porter was waking the wrong person for some sunrise expedition. Nothing happened. Wide awake now, he turned the switch on, but no light flooded the room. The electricians, he remembered of the curse, were out on strike. He fumbled for the matches, and as he did so, a voice in the corridor became distinctly audible. It was just outside his door. "Aren't you ready?" he heard. "You sleep forever." And the voice, although never having heard it before, he could not have recognised it, belonged, he knew suddenly, to the girl who had let the olive fall. In an instant he was out of bed. He lit a candle. "I'm coming," he called softly, as he slipped rapidly into some clothes. "I'm sorry I've kept you. I shan't be a minute." "Be quick, then," he heard, while the candle flame slowly grew and he found his garments. Less than 3 minutes later he opened the door and, candle in hand, peered into the dark passage. "Blow it out," came a peremptory whisper. He obeyed, but not quickly enough. A pair of red lips emerged from the shadows. There was a puff, poof, the candle was extinguished. "I've got my reputation to consider. We mustn't be seen, of course." The face vanished in the darkness, but he'd recognised it. The shining skin, the bright, glancing eyes. The sweet breath touched his cheek. The candlestick was taken from him by a swift, deft movement. He heard it knock the wainscoting as it was set down. He went out into a pitch-black corridor, where a soft hand seized his own and led him, by a back door it seemed, out into the open air of the hillside immediately behind the hotel. He saw the stars. The morning was cool and fragrant. The sharp air waked him, and the last vestiges of sleep went flying. He'd been drowsy and confused, had obeyed the summons without thinking. He now realised suddenly that he was engaged in an act of madness. The girl, dressed in some flimsy material, thrown loosely about her head and body, stood a few feet away, looking, he thought, like some figure called out of dreams and slumber of a forgotten world, out of legend almost. He saw her evening shoes peep out. He divined an evening dress beneath the gauzy covering. The light wind blew it close against her figure. He thought of a nymph. "I say, but haven't you been to bed?" he asked stupidly. He'd meant to expostulate, to apologise for his foolish rashness, to scold and say that he must go back at once. Instead, this sentence came. He guessed she'd been sitting up all night. He stood still a second, staring in mute admiration, his eyes full of bewildered question. "Watching the stars," she met his thought with a happy laugh. "Orion has touched the horizon. I came for you at once. We've got just 4 hours." The voice, the smile, the eyes, the reference to Orion swept him off his feet. Something in him broke loose and flew wildly, recklessly to the stars. "Let us be off," he cried, "before the bear tilts down. Already Alcyone begins to fade. I'm ready. Come." She laughed. The wind blew the gauze aside to show 2 ivory-white limbs. She caught his hand again, and they scampered together up the steep hillside towards the woods. Soon the big hotel, the villas, the white houses of the little town, where natives and visitors still lay soundly sleeping, were out of sight. The farther sky came down to meet them. The stars were paling, but no sign of actual dawn was yet visible. Freshness stung their cheeks. Slowly, the heavens grew lighter. The east turned rose. The outlines of the trees defined themselves. There was a stirring of the silvery green leaves. They were among olive groves, but the spirits of the trees were dancing. Far below them, a pool of deep colour, they saw the ancient sea. They saw the tiny specks of distant fishing boats. The sailors were singing to the dawn, and birds among the mimosa of the hanging gardens answered them. Pausing a moment at length beneath a gaunt old tree whose struggle to leave the clinging earth had tortured its great writhing arms and trunk, they took their breath, gazing at one another with eyes full of happy dreams. "You understand so quickly," said the girl, "my little message. I knew by your eyes and ears you would." And she first tweaked his ears with her two slender fingers mischievously, then laid her soft palm with a momentary light pressure on both eyes. "You're half and half at any rate," she added, looking him up and down for a swift instant of appraisal, "if you're not altogether." The laughter showed her white, even little teeth. "You know how to play, and that's something," she added. Then, as if to herself, "You'll be altogether before I've done with you." "Shall I?" he stammered, afraid to look at her. Puzzled, some spirit of compromise still lingering in him, he knew not what she meant. He knew only that the current of life flowed increasingly through his veins, but that her eyes confused him. "I'm longing for it," he added. "How wonderfully you did it! The role so awkwardly." "Oh, that!" She peered at him through a wisp of hair. "You kept it, I hope?" "Rather. It's on my mantelpiece." "You're sure you haven't eaten it?" And she made a delicious mimicry with her red lips so that he saw the tip of a small pointed tongue. "I shall keep it," he swore, "as long as these arms have life in them." And he seized her just as she was crouching to escape, and covered her with kisses. "I knew you longed to play," she panted when he released her. "Still, it was sweet of you to pick it up before another got it." "Another!" he exclaimed. "The gods decide. It's a lopsided thing, remember. It can't roll straight." She looked oddly mischievous, elusive. He stared at her. "If it had rolled elsewhere and another had picked it up," he began. "I should be with that other now." And this time she was off and away before he could prevent her, and the sound of her silvery laughter mocked him among the olive trees beyond. He was up and after her in a second, following her slim whiteness in and out of the old world grove as she flitted lightly, her hair flying in the wind, her figure flashing like a ray of sunlight or the race of foaming water, till at last he caught her and drew her down upon his knees, and kissing her wildly, forgot who and where and what he was. "Hark!" she whispered breathlessly, one arm close about his neck. "I hear their footsteps. Listen, it is the piper." "The pipe," he repeated, conscious of a tiny but delicious shudder, for a sudden chill ran through him as she said it. He gazed at her. Her hair fell loose about her cheeks, flushed and rosy with his hot kisses. Her eyes were bright and wild for all their softness. Her face turned sideways to him as she listened, or an extraordinary look that for an instant made his blood run cold. He saw the parted lips, the small white teeth, the slim neck of ivory, the young bosom panting from his tempestuous embrace. Of an unearthly loveliness and brightness she seemed to him, yet with this strange, remote expression that touched his soul with sudden terror. Her face turned slowly. "Who are you?" he whispered. He sprang to his feet without waiting for her to answer. He was young and agile, strong too, with that quick response of muscle they have who keep their bodies well, but he was no match for her. Her speed and agility outclassed his own with ease. She leapt. Before he had moved one leg forward towards escape, she was clinging with soft, supple arms and limbs about him so he could not free himself, and as her weight bore him downwards to the ground, her lips found his own and kissed them into silence. She lay buried again in his embrace, her hair across his eyes, her heart against his heart, and he forgot his question, forgot his little fear, forgot the very world he knew. They come, she cried gaily. The dawn is here. Are you ready? I've been ready for 5,000 years, he answered, leaping to his feet beside her. All together came upon a sparkling life that was like wind among the olive leaves. Shaking her last gauzy covering from her, she snatched his hand, and they ran forwards together to join the dancing throng now crowding up the slope beneath the trees. Their happy singing filled the sky, decked with vine and ivy and trailing silvery green branches. They poured in a flood of radiant life along the mountainside. Slowly they melted away into the blue distance of the breaking dawn, and as the last figure disappeared, the sun came up slowly out of a purple sea. They came to the place he knew, the deserted earthquake village, and a faint memory stirred in him. He didn't actually recall that he'd already visited it, had eaten sandwiches with hotel friends beneath its crumbling walls, but there was a dim, troubling sense of familiarity, nothing more. The houses still stood, but pigeons lived in them. Weasels, stoats and snakes had their uncertain homes in ancient bedrooms. Not 20 years ago, the peasants thronged its narrow streets, through which the dawn now peered, and cool wind breathed among dew-laden brambles. I know the house, she cried, the house where we would live, and raced, a flying form of air and sunlight, into a tumbled cottage that had no roof, no floor or windows. Wild bees had hung a nest against the broken wall. He followed her. There was sunlight in the room, and there were flowers. Upon a rude, simple table lay a bowl of cream with eggs and honey and butter close against a homemade loaf. They sank into each other's arms upon a couch of fragrant grass and boughs against the window where wild roses bloomed. The bees flew in and out. It was Busana, the so-called earthquake village, because a sudden earthquake had fallen on it one summer morning when all the inhabitants were at church. The crashing roof killed 60, the tumbling walls another 100, and the rest had left it where it stood. The church, she said, vaguely remembering the story. They were at prayer. The girl laughed carelessly in his ear, setting his blood in a rush and quiver of delicious joy. He felt himself untamed, wild as the wind and animals. The true God claimed his own, she whispered. He came back. Ah, they were not ready. The old priests had seen to that, but he came. They heard his music. Then his tread shook the olive groves. The old ground danced. The hills leapt for joy. And the houses crumbled. He laughed as he pressed her closer to his heart. And now we've come back, she cried merrily. We've come back to worship and be glad. She nestled into him while the sun rose higher. I hear them. Hark, she cried, and again leapt, dancing from his side. Again he followed her like wind. Through the broken window they saw the naked fauns and nymphs and satyrs, rolling, dancing, shaking their soft hoofs amid the ferns and brambles. Towards the appalling ruptured church they sped with feet of light and air. A roar of happy song and laughter rose. Come, he cried, we must go too. Hand in hand they raced to join the tumbling, dancing throng. She was in his arms and on his back and flung across his shoulders as he ran. They reached the broken building. Its whole roof had gone sliding years ago. Its walls had trembled still, its shattered shrines alive with nesting birds. Hush, she whispered in a tone of awe, yet pleasure. He is there. She pointed, her bare arm outstretched above the bending heads. There, in the empty space, where once stood sacred host and cup, he sat, filling the niche sublimely and with awful power. His shaggy form, benign yet terrible, rose through the broken stone. The great eyes shone, smiled. The feet were lost in brambles. "God!" cried a wild, frightened voice, yet with deep worship in it. The old familiar panic came with portentous swiftness. The great figure rose. The birds flew screaming, the animals sought holes, the worshippers, laughing and glad a moment ago, rushed tumbling over one another for the doors. "He goes again! Who called? Who called like that? His feet shake the ground!" "'Tis the earthquake!" screamed a woman's shrill accents in ghastly terror. "Kiss me, one kiss before we forget again," sighed a laughing, passionate voice against his ear. "Once more, your arms, your heart beating on my lips. You recognize his power. You are now all together. We shall remember." But he woke, with the heavy bedclothes stuffed against his mouth and the wind of early morning sighing mournfully about the hotel walls. "Have they left again, those ladies?" he inquired casually of the head waiter, pointing to the table. "They were here last night at dinner." "What do you mean?" replied the man stupidly, gazing at the spot indicated, with a face quite blank. "Last night at dinner?" He tried to think. "An elderly lady, English, with her daughter." At which moment precisely the girl came in alone. Lunch was over, the room empty. There was a second's difficult pause. It seemed ridiculous not to speak. Their eyes met. The girl blushed furiously. He was very quick for an Englishman. I was allowing myself to ask after your mother," he began. "I was afraid—" He glanced at the table laid for one. "She was not well, perhaps." "Oh, but that's very kind of you, I'm sure." She smiled. He saw the small, white, even teeth. And before 3 days had passed, he was so deeply in love that he simply couldn't help himself. "I believe," he said lamely, "this is yours. You dropped it, you know. May I keep it? It's only an olive." They were, of course, in an olive grove when he asked it, and the sun was setting. She looked at him, looked him up and down, looked at his ears, his eyes. He felt that in another second her little fingers would slip up and tweak the first or close the second with a soft pressure. "Tell me," he begged, "did you dream anything? That first night I saw you?" She took a quick step backwards. "No," she said, as he followed her, more quickly still. I don't think I did. But," she went on, breathlessly as he caught her up, "I knew from the way you picked it up." "Knew what?" he demanded, holding her tightly so she could not get away again. "That you were already half and half, but would soon be altogether." And as he kissed her, he felt her soft little fingers tweak his ear. "Whenever I walk in a London street, I'm ever so careful to watch my feet. And I keep in the squares, and the masses of bears who wait at the corners all ready to eat the sillies who tread on the lines in the street go back to their lairs, and I say to them, 'Bears, just look how I'm walking in all the squares.' And the little bears growl to each other, 'He's mine, as soon as he's silly and steps on a line.' And some of the bigger bears try to pretend that they came round the corner to look for a friend, and they try to pretend that nobody cares whether you walk on the lines or squares. But only the sillies believe their talk. It's ever so important how you walk, and it's ever so jolly to call out, 'Bears, just watch me walking in all the squares.'" "Morning, Jeeves," I said. "Good morning, sir," said Jeeves. He put the good old cup of tea softly on the table by my bed, and I took a refreshing sip. Just right, as usual. Not too hot, not too sweet, not too weak, not too strong, not too much milk, and not a drop spilled in the saucer. An amazing cove, Jeeves. So dashed competent in every respect. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I mean to say, just take one small instance. Every other valet I've ever had used to barge into my room in the morning while I was still asleep, causing much misery. But Jeeves seems to know when I'm awake by a sort of telepathy. He always floats in with the cup exactly 2 minutes after I come to life. Makes a deuce of a lot of difference to a fellow's day. How's the weather, Jeeves? Exceptionally clement, sir. Anything in the papers? Some slight friction threatening in the Balkans, sir. Otherwise, nothing. I say, Jeeves, I met a man at the club last night. Told me to put my shirt on privateer for the 2 o'clock race this afternoon. How about it? I should not advocate it, sir. The stable is not sanguine. Oh, that was enough for me. Jeeves knows. How? I couldn't say, but he knows. There was a time when I would laugh lightly and go ahead and lose my little all against his advice, but not now. Talking of shirts, I said, have those mauve ones I ordered arrived yet? Yes, sir. I sent them back. Sent them back? Yes, sir. They would not have become you. Well, I must say I'd thought fairly highly of those shirtings, but I bowed to superior knowledge. Weak? I don't know. Most fellows, no doubt, are all for having their valets confine their activities to creasing trousers and whatnot without trying to run the home, but it's different with Jeeves. Right from the first day he came to me, I've looked on him as a sort of a guide, philosopher and friend. Mr. Little rang up on the telephone a few moments ago. I informed him that you were not yet awake, sir. Oh, did he leave a message? No, sir. He mentioned that he had a matter of importance to discuss with you, but confided no details. Oh, well, I expect I shall be seeing him at the club. No doubt, sir. It wasn't what you might call, I wasn't in a fever of impatience. Bingo Little's a chap I was at school with, and we see a lot of each other still. He's the nephew of old Mortimer Little, who retired from business recently with a goodish pile. You've probably heard of Little's liniment. It limbers up the legs. Bingo biffs about London on a pretty comfortable allowance given him by his uncle and leads on the whole a fairly unclouded life. It wasn't likely that anything he described as a matter of importance would turn out to be really so frightfully important. I took it that he'd discovered some new brand of cigarette he wanted me to try or something like that and didn't spoil my breakfast by worrying. After breakfast, I lit a cigarette and went to the open window to inspect the day. Certainly was one of the best and brightest. Jeeves, I said. Sir, said Jeeves. He'd been clearing away the breakfast things, but at the sound of the young master's voice, cheesed it courteously. You are absolutely right about the weather. It is a juicy morning. Decidedly, sir. Spring and all that? Yes, sir. In the spring, Jeeves, a livelier iris gleams upon the burnished dove. So I have been informed, sir. Right-ho, then bring me my whangy. A whangy, if we didn't know, is a cane made from a number of Asian bamboos. So bring me my whangy, my yellowest shoes and my old green Homburg. I'm going to the park to do pastoral dances. I don't know if you know that sort of feeling you get on these days round about the end of April and the beginning of May, when the sky is a light blue with cotton wool clouds and there's a bit of a breeze blowing from the west. Kind of uplifted feeling. Romantic, if you know what I mean. I'm not much of a ladies' man, but on this particular morning it seemed to me that what I really wanted was some charming girl to buzz up and ask me to save her from assassins or something. So it was a bit of an anticlimax. I merely ran into young Bingo Little, looking perfectly foul in a crimson satin tie decorated with horseshoes. "Oh, Bertie," said Bingo. "My God, man," I gargled, the cravat, the gent's neckwear. Why? For what reason? "Oh, the tie," he blushed. I was given it." He seemed embarrassed, so I dropped the subject. We toddled along a bit and sat down on a couple of chairs by the Serpentine. "Oh, Jeeves tells me you want to talk to me about something," I said. "Eh?" said Bingo with a start. "Oh, yes. Yes. I waited for him to unleash the topic of the day, but he didn't seem to want to get going. Conversation languished. He stared straight ahead of him in a glassy sort of manner. "I say, Bertie," he said after a pause of an hour and a quarter. "Hello! Do you like the name Mabel. No. 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 You don't think there's kind of music in the word, like the wind rustling gently through the tree-tops? No. He seemed disappointed for a moment, then cheered up. Of course you wouldn't. You always were a fat-headed worm without any soul, weren't you? Oh, just as you say. Who is she? Tell me all. For I realised now that poor old Bingo was going through it again. Ever since I've known him and we were at school together, he's been perpetually falling in love with someone, generally in the spring, which seems to act on him like magic. At school he had the finest collection of actresses' photographs of anyone of his time, and at Oxford his romantic nature was a byword. "You'd better come along and meet her at lunch," he said, looking at his watch. "A ripe suggestion," I said. "Where are you meeting her? At the Ritz?" "Oh, near the Ritz." He was geographically accurate. About 50 yards east of the Ritz, there's one of those blighted tea and bun shops you see dotted about all over London, and into this, if you'll believe me, young Bingo dived like a homing rabbit. And before I had time to say a word, we were wedged in at a table on the brink of a silent pool of coffee left there by an early luncher. I'm bound to say I couldn't quite follow the development of the scenario. Bingo, while not absolutely rolling in the stuff, has always had a fair amount of the ready. Apart from what he got from his uncle, I knew he had finished up the jumping season well on the right side of the ledger. Why, then, was he lunching the girl at this God-forsaken eatery? It couldn't be because he was hard up. Just then the waitress arrived, rather a pretty girl. "Aren't we going to wait?" I started to say to Bingo, thinking it somewhat thick that, in addition to asking a girl to lunch with him in a place like this, he would fling himself on the foodstuffs before she turned up, when I caught sight of his face and stopped. The man was goggling. His entire map was suffused with a rich blush. He looked like the Soul's Awakening done in pink. "Hello, Mabel," he said with a sort of gulp. "Hello," said the girl. "Mabel," said Bingo, "this is Bertie Wooster, pal of mine." "Pleased to meet you," she said. "Nice morning." "Fine," I said. Uh, "You see, I'm wearing a tie," said Bingo. "Suits you beautiful," said the girl. Personally, if anyone had told me that a tie like that suited me, I should have risen and struck them on the mazzard, regardless of their age and sex. But poor old Bingo simply got all flustered with gratification and smirked in the most gruesome manner. "Well, what's it going to be today?" asked the girl, introducing the business touch into the conversation. Bingo studied the menu devoutly. "Oh, I'll have a cup of cocoa, cold veal and ham pie, slice of fruit cake, and a macaroon. Same for you, Bertie?" I gazed at the man, revolted. That he could have been a pal of mine all these years and think me capable of insulting the old turn with this sort of stuff cut me to the quick. Or how about a bit of hot steak pudding with a sparkling limado to wash it down?" said Bingo. You know, the way love can change a fellow was really frightful to contemplate. This chappie before me, who spoke in that absolutely careless way of macaroons and limado, was the man I had seen in happier days telling the head waiter at Claridge's exactly how he wanted the chef to prepare the sole feet au gourmet aux champignons, and saying he would jolly well sling it back if it wasn't just right. Ghastly! Ghastly! A roll and butter and a small coffee seemed the only things on the list that hadn't been specially prepared by the nastier-minded members of Borgia family for people they had a particular grudge against. So I chose them, and Mabel hopped it. "Well," said Bingo rapturously. I took it that he wanted my opinion of the female poisoner who'd just left us. "Very nice," I said. He seemed dissatisfied. "You don't think she's the most wonderful girl you ever saw?" he said wistfully. "Oh, absolutely," I said to appease the blighter. "Where did you meet her?" "At a subscription dance at Camberwell." "What on earth were you doing at a subscription dance at Camberwell?" "Oh, your man Jeeves asked me if I'd buy a couple of tickets. It was in aid of some charity or other." "Jeeves? I didn't know he went in for that sort of thing." "Well, I suppose he has to relax a bit every now and then. Anyway, he was there. swinging a dashed efficient shoe. Hadn't meant to go at first, but I turned up for a lark. Oh, Bertie, think what I might have missed." "What might you have missed?" I asked, the old lemon being slightly clouded. "Mabel, you chump. If I hadn't gone, I shouldn't have met Mabel." "Oh, ah." At this point, Bingo fell into a species of trance and only came out of it to wrap himself round the pie and macaroon. "Bertie," he said, "I want your advice." "Carry on. Or at least not your advice, because that wouldn't be much good to anybody. I mean, you're a pretty consummate old ass, aren't you? Not that I want to hurt your feelings, of course." "Oh, no, I see that." What I wish you would do is put the whole thing to that fellow Jeeves of yours and see what he suggests. You've often told me that he's helped other pals of yours out of messes. From what you tell me, he's by way of being the brains of the family. He's never let me down yet." "Then put my case to him." "What case?" "My problem." "What problem?" "Why, you poor fish, my uncle, of course. What do you think my uncle's going to say to all this? If I sprang it on him cold, he'd tie himself in knots on the hearthrug. Oh, one of those emotional Johnnies, eh? Somehow or other his mind has got to be prepared to receive the news, but how?" "Ah. Oh, that's a lot of help, that ah. You see, I'm pretty well dependent on the old boy. If he cut off my allowance, I should be very much in the soup. So you put the whole binge to Jeeves and see if he can't scare up a happy ending somehow. Tell him my future is in his hands, and that if the wedding bells ring out, he can rely on me, even unto half my kingdom. Well, call it 10 quid. Jeeves would exert himself with 10 quid on the horizon. What?" "Undoubtedly," I said. I wasn't in the least surprised at Bingo wanting to lug Jeeves into his private affairs like this. It was the first thing I would have thought of doing myself if I'd been in a hole of any description. As I frequently had occasion to observe, he's a bird of the ripest intellect, full of bright ideas. If anybody could fix things for poor Bingo, he could. I stated the case to him that night after dinner. "Jeeves?" "Sir?" Are you busy just now?" "No, sir." I mean, not doing anything in particular?" "No, sir. It is my practice at this hour to read some improving book, but if you desire my services, this can easily be postponed or indeed abandoned altogether." "Well, I want your advice. It's about Mr. Little." "Young Mr. Little, sir, or the elder Mr. Little, his uncle, who lives in Pounceby Gardens?" Jeeves seemed to know everything. Most amazing thing. I've been palling with Bingo practically all my life, yet I didn't remember ever having heard that his uncle lived anywhere in particular. "How did you know he lived in Pounceby Gardens?" I said. "I am on terms of some intimacy with the elder Mr. Little's cook, sir, and in fact there is an understanding." I'm bound to say that this gave me a bit of a start. Somehow I'd never thought of Jeeves going in for that sort of thing. "Do you mean you're engaged?" "It may be said to amount to that, sir." Well. "She's a remarkably excellent cook, sir," said Jeeves, as though he felt called on to give some explanation. "What was it you wished to ask me about Mr. Little?" I sprang the details on him. "And that's how the matter stands, Jeeves," I said. "I think we ought to rally round a trifle and help old Bingo put the thing through. Tell me about old Mr. Little. What sort of a chap is he?" "Oh, a somewhat curious character, sir. Since retiring from business, he has become a great recluse, and now devotes himself almost entirely to the pleasures of the table." "A greedy hog, you mean?" "Oh, I would not, perhaps, take the liberty of describing him in precisely those terms, sir. He is what is usually called a gourmet, very particular about what he eats, and for that reason sets a high value on Miss Watson's services." "The cook?" "Yes, sir." "Well, looks to me as though our best plan will be to shoot young Bingo in on him after dinner one night. Melting mood, I mean to say, and all that." "The difficulty is, sir, that at the moment Mr. Little is on a diet, owing to an attack of gout." "Things begin to look wobbly." "No, sir. I fancy that the elder Mr. Little's misfortune may be turned to the younger Mr. Little's advantage. I was speaking only the other day to Mr. Little's valet, and he was telling me that it has become his principal duty to read to Mr. Little in the evenings. If I were in your place, sir, I should send young Mr. Little to read to his uncle. Nephew's devotion, you mean? Old man touched by kindly action, what? Partly that, sir, but I would rely more on young Mr. Little's choice of literature. Oh, that's no good. Jolly old Bingo has a kind face, but when it comes to literature, he stops at the Sporting Times. That difficulty may be overcome. I would be happy to select books for Mr. Little to read. Perhaps I may explain my idea further. I can't say I quite grasp it yet. The method I advocate is what, I believe, the advertisers call direct suggestion, sir, consisting as it does of driving an idea home by constant repetition. You may have had experience of the system? Oh, you mean they keep on telling you that some soap or other is the best, and after a bit you come under the influence and charge round the corner and buy a cake? Exactly, sir. The same method was the basis of all the most valuable propaganda during the recent war. I see no reason why it should not be adopted to bring about the desired result with regard to the subject's views on class distinctions. If young Mr. Little were to read day after day to his uncle a series of narratives in which marriage with young persons of an inferior social status was held up as both feasible and admirable, I fancy it would prepare the elder Mr. Little's mind for the reception of the information that his nephew wishes to marry a waitress in a tea shop. Are there any books of that sort nowadays? Only ones I ever seen mentioned in the papers are about married couples who find life grey and can't stick each other at any price. Yes, sir, there are a great many, neglected by the reviewers, but widely read. You have never encountered All for Love by Rosie M. Banks? No. Nor A Red Summer Rose by the same author? No. I have an aunt, sir, who owns an almost complete set of Rosie M. Bankses. I could easily borrow as many volumes as young Mr. Little might require. They make very light, attractive reading. Well, it's worth trying. I should certainly recommend the scheme, sir. All right, then, toddle round to your aunt's tomorrow and grab a couple of the fruitiest. We can but have a dash at it. Precisely, sir. Bingo reported 3 days later that Rosie M. Banks was the goods and, beyond a question, the stuff to give the troops. Old Little had jibbed somewhat at first at the proposed change of literary diet, he not being much of a lad for fiction and having stuck hitherto exclusively to the heavier monthly reviews, but Bingo had got chapter 1 of All for Love past his guard before he knew it was happening. After that there was nothing to it. Since then they'd finished A Red Summer Rose, Madcap Myrtle, and Only a Factory Girl, and were halfway through The Courtship of Lord Strathmorlick. Bingo told me all this in a husky voice over an egg beaten up in sherry. The only blot on the thing from his point of view was that it wasn't doing a bit of good to the old vocal cords, which were beginning to show signs of cracking under the strain. He'd been looking up his symptoms in a medical dictionary and thought he'd got clergyman's throat. But against this you had to set the fact that he was making an undoubted hit in the right quarter, and also that, after the evening's reading, he also stayed on to dinner, and from what he told me, the dinners turned out by Old Little's cooks had to be tasted to be believed. There were tears in the old blighter's eyes as he got on the subject of the clear soup. I suppose to a fellow who for weeks has been tackling macaroons and limado, it must have been like heaven. Old Little wasn't able to give any practical assistance at these banquets, but Bingo says he came to the table and had his whack of arrowroot and sniffed the dishes, told stories of entrees he'd had in the past, and sketched out scenarios of what he was going to do to the bill of fare in the future when the doctor put him in shape. So I suppose he enjoyed himself too, in a way. Anyhow, things seemed to be buzzing along quite satisfactorily, and Bingo said he'd got an idea which he thought was going to clinch the thing. He wouldn't tell me what it was, but he said it was a pippin. We make progress, Jeeves, I said. That is very satisfactory, sir. Mr. Little tells me that when he came to the big scene in Only a Factory Girl, his uncle gulped like a stricken bullpup. Indeed, sir. Where Lord Claude takes the girl in his arms, you know, and says, I am familiar with the passage, sir. It is distinctly moving. It was a great favourite of my aunt's. I think we're on the right track. It would seem so, sir. In fact, this looks like being another of your successes. I've always said, and I shall also say, that for sheer brains, Jeeves, you stand alone. All the other great thinkers of the age are simply in the crowd watching you go by. Thank you very much, sir. I endeavour to give satisfaction. About a week after this, Bingo blew in with the news that his uncle's gout had ceased to trouble him, and that on the morrow he'd be back at the old stand, working away with knife and fork as before. Oh, by the way, said Bingo, who wants you to lunch with him tomorrow? Me? Why me? He doesn't know I exist. Oh, yes, he does. I've told him about you. What have you told him? Oh, various things. Anyhow, I want to meet you and take my tip, laddie. You go. I should think lunch tomorrow will be something special. I don't know why it was, but even then it struck me that there was something dashed odd, almost sinister, if you know what I mean, about young Bingo's manner. The old egg had the air of one who has something up his sleeve. There's more in this than meets the eye, I said. Why should your uncle ask a fellow to lunch whom he's never seen? Oh, my dear old fathead, haven't I just said I've been telling him all about you? That you're my best pal, at school together and all that sort of thing? But even then, and another thing, why are you so dashed keen on me going? Bingo hesitated for a moment. Well, I told you I've got an idea. This is it. I want you to spring the news on him. I haven't the nerve myself. What? I'm hanged if I do. And you call yourself a pal of mine? Yes, I know, but there are limits. Bertie, said Bingo reproachfully, I saved your life once. When? Didn't I? Oh, it must have been some other fellow then. Well, anyway, we were boys together and all that. You can't let me down. Oh, all right, I said, but when you say you haven't nerve enough for any dashed thing in the world, you misjudge yourself. A fellow who... Cheerio, said young Bingo. 1:30 tomorrow. Don't be late. I'm bound to say that the more I contemplated the binge, the less I liked it. It was all very well for Bingo to say that I was slated for a magnificent lunch, but what good is the best possible lunch to a fellow if he's slung out into the street on his ear during the soup course? However, the word of a Worcester is bond, and all that sort of rot. So at 1:30 next day, I tottered up the steps of number 16, Pounceby Gardens, and punched the bell. And half a minute later, I was up in the drawing room shaking hands with the fattest man I've ever seen in my life. The motto of the little family was evidently variety. Young Bingo's long and thin and hasn't a superfluous ounce on him. Not since we first met. But the uncle restored the average and a bit over. The hand which grasped mine wrapped it round and enfolded it till I began to wonder if I'd ever get it out without excavating machinery. Mr. Worcester, I am gratified, I'm proud, I'm honoured. It seemed to me that young Bingo must have boosted me to some purpose. Oh, I said. He stepped back a bit, still hanging on to the good right hand. You are very young to have accomplished so much. I couldn't follow the train of thought. The family, especially my Aunt Agatha, who savaged me incessantly from childhood up, had always rather made a point of the fact that mine is a wasted life, and that since I won the prize at my first school for the best collection of wild flowers made during the summer holidays, I haven't done a damn thing to land me on the nation's scroll of fame. I was wondering if he couldn't have got me mixed up with someone else when the telephone bell rang outside in the hall and the maid came in to say that I was wanted. I buzzed down and found it was young Bingo. Hello, said young Bingo. So you got there. Good man. I knew I could rely on you. I say, old crumpet, did my uncle seem pleased to see you? Absolutely all over me. I can't make it out. Oh, that's all right. I just rang up to explain. Fact is, old man, I know you won't mind, but I told him that you were the author of those books I've been reading to him. What? Yes, I said Rosie M. Banks was your pen name, and you didn't want it generally known because you were a modest, retiring sort of chap. He'll listen to you now. Absolutely hang on your words. A brightish idea, what? I doubt if Jeeves in person could have thought of a better one than that. Well, pitch it strong, old lad. keep steadily before you the fact that I must have my allowance raised. I can't possibly marry on what I've got now. If this film is to end with the slow fade out on the embrace, at least double as indicated. Well, that's that. Cheerio! And he rang off. By that moment the gong sounded, and the genial host came tumbling downstairs like the delivery of a ton of coals. I always look back to that lunch with a sort of aching regret. It was the lunch of a lifetime, and I wasn't in a fit state to appreciate it. Subconsciously, if you know what I mean, I could see it was pretty special, but I'd got the wind up to such a frightful extent over the ghastly situation which Bingo had landed me that its deeper meaning never really penetrated. Most of the time I might have been eating sawdust for all the good it did me. Old Little struck the literary note right from the start. My nephew has probably told you that I have been making a close study of your books of late, he began. Yes, he did mention it. How did you like the ballet things? He gazed reverently at me. Mr. Wooster, I'm not ashamed to say that the tears came into my eyes as I listened to them. It amazes me that a man as young as you can have been able to plumb human nature so surely to its depth, to play with so unerring a hand on the quivering heartstrings of your reader, to write novels so true, so human, so moving, so vital. Oh, it's just a knack, I said. The good old persp was bedewing my forehead by this time in pretty lavish manner. I don't know when I've been so rattled. Do you find the room a trifle warm? Oh, no, rather not. Just right. Oh, then it's the pepper. If my cook has a fault, which I'm not prepared to admit, it is that she's inclined to stress the pepper a trifle in her made dishes. By the way, do you like her cooking? I was so relieved that as we got off the subject of my literary output that I shouted approval in a ringing baritone. I'm delighted to hear it, Mr. Worcester. I may be prejudiced, but to my mind that woman is a genius. Absolutely, I said. She's been with me 7 years, and in all that time I have not known her guilty of a single lapse from the highest standard, except once in the winter of 1917, when a purist might have condemned a certain mayonnaise of hers as lacking in creaminess. But one must make allowances. There had been several air raids about that time, and no doubt the poor woman was shaking. But nothing is perfect in this world, Mr. Wooster, and I've had my cross to bear. For 7 years I have lived in constant apprehension lest some evilly disposed person might lure her from my employment. To my certain knowledge she has received offers, lucrative offers, to accept service elsewhere. You may judge of my dismay, Mr. Wooster, when only this morning the bolt fell. She gave notice. Good Lord! Your consternation does credit, if I may so, to the heart of the author of Red Summer Rose. But I am thankful to say the worst has not happened. The matter has been adjusted. Jane is not leaving me. Good egg! Good egg indeed, though the expression is not familiar to me. I do not remember having come across it in your books. And speaking of your books, may I say that what has impressed me about them even more than the moving poignancy of the actual narrative is your philosophy of life. If there were more men like you, Mr. Wooster, London would be a better place. This was dead opposite to my Aunt Agatha's philosophy of life, she having always rather given me to understand that it's the presence in it of chappies like me that makes London more or less a plague spot. But I let it go. Let me tell you, Mr. Wooster, that I appreciate your splendid defiance of the outworn fetishes of a purblind social system. I appreciate it. You are big enough to see that rank is but the guinea stamp, and that, in the magnificent words of Lord Bletchmore in Only a Factory Girl, be her origin ne'er so humble, a good woman is the equal, the finest lady on earth. I sat up. I say, do you think that? I do, Mr. Wooster. I am ashamed to say there was a time when I was like other men, a slave to the idiotic convention which we call class distinction, but since I read your books... I might have known it. Jeeves had done it again. You think it's all right for a chappie in what you might call a certain social position to marry a girl of what you might describe as the lower classes? Most assuredly I do, Mr. Worcester. I took a deep breath and slipped him the good news. Your Bingo, young Bingo, your nephew, you know, wants to marry a waitress, I said. I honour him for it, said old Little. You don't object? On the contrary. I took another deep breath and shifted to the sordid side of the business. I hope you won't think I'm butting in, don't you know, I said, but, well, how about it? I fear I did not quite follow you. Well, I mean to say, his allowance and all that, the money you're good enough to give him, he was rather hoping that you might see a way to jerking up the total a bit. Old Little shook his head regretfully. I fear that can hardly be managed. You see, a man in my position is compelled to save every penny. I will gladly continue my nephew's existing allowance, but beyond that I cannot go. It would not be fair to my wife. What? But you're not married? Not yet. But I propose to enter upon that holy state almost immediately. The lady who for years has cooked so well for me honoured me by accepting my hand this very morning. A cold gleam of triumph came into his eye. Now let 'em try to get her away from me, he muttered defiantly. Young Mr. Little has been trying frequently during the afternoon to reach you on the telephone, sir, said Jeeves that night when I got home. I'll bet he has, I said. I'd sent poor old Bingo an outline of the situation by messenger boy shortly after lunch. He seemed a trifle agitated. I don't wonder, Jeeves, I said. So brace up and bite the bullet. I'm afraid I've bad news for you. That scheme of yours, reading those books to old Mr. Little and all that, has blown out a fuse. They did not soften him? They did. Oh, that's the whole bally trouble, Jeeves. I'm sorry to say that fiancée of yours, Miss Watson, you know, the cook, you know, well, the long and the short of it is that she's chosen riches instead of honest worth, if you know what I mean. Sir? She's handed you the mitten and gone and got engaged to old Mr. Little. Indeed, sir. Well, you don't seem much upset. The fact is, sir, I had anticipated some such outcome. I stared at him. Then what on earth did you suggest the scheme for? To tell you the truth, sir, I was not wholly averse for a severance of my relations with Miss Watson. In fact, I greatly desired it. I respect Miss Watson exceedingly, but I have seen for a long time that we are not suited. Now, the other young person with whom I have an understanding. Great Scott, Jeeves, there isn't another? Yes, sir. How long has this been going on? Oh, for some weeks, sir. I was greatly attracted by her when I first met her at a subscription dance at Camberwell. My sainted aunt, not... Jeeves inclined his head gravely. Yes, sir. By an odd coincidence, it is the same young person that young Mr. Little... I've placed the cigarettes on the small table. Good night, sir. John had great big waterproof boots on. John had a great big waterproof hat. John had a great big waterproof mackintosh, and that, said John, is that.